The girl stood on that platform like she'd been standing there all her life, waiting to be measured, waiting to be judged, waiting to be sold. Her name was Eleanor Cain, though nobody in that crowd bothered to remember it. 19 years of hard living had carved lines into her hands that told stories her mouth would never speak. The auctioneer's voice droned through the September heat, listing her qualities like she was livestock. Strong back, quiet disposition, no family ties worth mentioning. The crowd barely looked up from their whiskey and their gossip. Eleanor's mother sat in the back, fanning herself with a torn piece of newspaper, already counting the money in her mind. She'd brought 4 daughters to auction over the years. This one was the last. The final burden to be lifted from shoulders that had grown tired of carrying anything but regret. The men in the crowd examined Eleanor with eyes that saw only what she could do, never who she might be. They calculated her worth in meals cooked and floors scrubbed and fields worked until sundown. Not one of them saw the way she held her spine straight despite everything trying to break it. Not one of them noticed how her eyes still searched the horizon like freedom might be hiding just beyond the ridge. Then there was Samuel Hayes. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same hard wood as the fence posts on his failing ranch. 42 years old, and already worn down to his foundations. His wife had died 3 winters back, and he'd buried a son before that, buried them both in the cold ground behind his house where the wind never stopped singing its lonely songs. Samuel hadn't come to town looking for anything. He'd come because the feed store needed paying and the bank needed reminding that he still existed. But something about the way Eleanor stood there, not broken, just bent, made him remember what it felt like to be seen as nothing more than what you could produce. The bidding started low and stayed there. Men offered prices that wouldn't buy a decent horse, and Eleanor's mother nodded eagerly at every insult disguised as an offer. The girl didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't beg. She just stood there like a tree that had survived too many storms to be surprised by one more. Samuel raised his hand. The number he called out wasn't generous, but it was final. It was the kind of number that said, "This ends now." The auctioneer looked around for other bidders, found none, and brought his hammer down with a crack that sounded like a door slamming shut on one life and opening on another. Eleanor's mother took the money and disappeared into the crowd before the dust settled. She didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, didn't offer even the smallest mercy of a final word. Some abandonments happen slowly, over years of neglect. This one happened in the time it took to count bills and walk away. Samuel approached the platform with heavy steps. He looked up at Eleanor and she looked down at him, and for a moment they were just 2 people who understood that life had been unkind and would likely stay that way. He didn't smile, didn't offer empty promises, didn't pretend this transaction was anything other than what it was. What he did do was offer her his hand, not to pull her down like property being claimed, but to steady her as she stepped down on her own. That small gesture, that tiny act of recognizing her as someone who could walk rather than be taken, that was the first seed of what would eventually grow between them. The townspeople watched them leave together, Samuel and Eleanor, walking toward his wagon like 2 ghosts who'd somehow found each other in the land of the living. The gossip started before they'd even cleared the edge of town. Cruel speculations about what a man really wanted with a girl young enough to be his daughter. Vicious assumptions about what she'd have to do to earn her keep. Neither of them heard it. They were already too far gone. Already moving toward something neither of them could name yet, already beginning the long journey from transaction to trust. The wagon rolled out across the flatlands as the sun began its slow descent, and Eleanor sat beside Samuel in silence that felt less like absence and more like waiting to see what came next, waiting to learn if this new life would be another cage, or perhaps, finally, a door left unlocked, or left. The Hayes Ranch appeared on the horizon, like a promise someone had forgotten to keep. Samuel's land stretched across 300 acres of stubborn earth that gave up its bounty reluctantly and only after brutal negotiation. The house stood weathered and grey, its paint long since surrendered to the elements, its shutters hanging at angles that suggested exhaustion rather than disrepair. This was a place that had seen better days and was still waiting for them to return. Eleanor studied it all from the wagon seat, taking inventory of her new world, the way a prisoner might study the walls of their cell. But Samuel noticed something the girl probably didn't realize she was doing. She was looking at the land itself, not just the work it represented. She was seeing the way the evening light caught the tall grass, the way the mountains pressed up against the sky in the distance, the way space itself could be a kind of freedom. They arrived as dusk began painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Samuel helped Eleanor down from the wagon, that same careful gesture, that same recognition of her autonomy, and led her toward the house without ceremony or explanation. The door opened with a creak that spoke of loneliness, and inside was exactly what she'd expected, a man's space, functional and sparse, every corner holding memories of people no longer there to occupy them. He showed her to a small room off the kitchen. It had been a pantry once, maybe a sewing room, but Samuel had put a narrow bed in there and a table with a lamp, and left the door with no lock on either side. The window looked out toward the eastern fields, where the first light would come each morning. "This is yours," he told her with his eyes, even though his mouth said nothing. "This space, this choice of whether to close the door or leave it open, this belongs to you." Eleanor set down the small bundle that contained everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a comb with missing teeth, a book with water-damaged pages she'd taught herself to read from. She stood in the center of that small room and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it, the absence of immediate threat. That first night passed in careful distance. Samuel made a simple meal, beans and cornbread and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the stove since morning. They ate in silence, not the comfortable kind, but not cruel either. Just the silence of 2 people who'd learned that words could be weapons, and sometimes quiet was the kindest thing you could offer. After dinner, Samuel showed Eleanor where things were kept: the well, the barn, the root cellar, the chicken coop, where 6 stubborn hens scratched out their existence. He explained the routine of the ranch without expecting her to follow it, just laying out the pattern of his days in case she wanted to find her place within them. Then he bid her good night and retired to his own room at the far end of the house, leaving that distance between them like a buffer zone between 2 countries that hadn't yet decided if they were at war or peace. Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of this new place, the wind moving through gaps in the walls, the settling of old wood, the distant cry of something wild out in the darkness. She kept her eyes open for hours, watching the moonlight move across the floor, waiting for the trap to spring, waiting for Samuel to come through that unlocked door with expectations and demands. He never came. Morning arrived with the kind of light that makes promises, soft and golden, and full of possibility. Eleanor woke to find herself still alone, still safe, still trying to understand what kind of arrangement this actually was. She rose and dressed, and found Samuel already outside, working in the barn, giving her space to move through the house without his presence as a weight upon her. She made breakfast because that's what she knew how to do, biscuits and eggs from those stubborn hens, and more of that strong coffee. When Samuel came in, he looked surprised, not displeased, just surprised, like he'd forgotten what it was to have someone think of his needs without being commanded to do so. They fell into a rhythm those first weeks. Not a routine exactly, because both of them were too wary to commit fully to patterns that might become cages, but a rhythm, a dance of proximity and distance, of working alongside each other without working together, of existing in the same space while still maintaining separate territories of self. Eleanor took on tasks without being asked, mending, cooking, tending the garden that had gone half wild in Samuel's grief. But she did them in her own time, in her own way, and Samuel never questioned her methods or her pace. He worked the land from dawn to dusk, fixing what was broken, tending what grew, fighting the daily battle against entropy that every rancher knows by heart. In the evenings, they sat on the porch as the heat broke and the world cooled into something bearable. Sometimes Samuel would talk about the land, where the good water was, which fields flooded in spring, where the cattle liked to gather when storms came. Never about himself, never about his past, just about the practical geography of survival. Eleanor listened and learned. She was good at listening, good at gathering information that might someday prove useful, good at understanding the territory before committing to occupy it. She watched how Samuel moved through his days with a kind of integrity that surprised her. He was exactly who he appeared to be. No hidden cruelties, no sudden changes of temperament, just a steady, worn-down honesty that wore his exhaustion on the outside where she could see it. Slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, Eleanor began to relax. Not completely, never completely, but the constant vigilance that had kept her alive for 19 years began to ease just slightly. She slept a little deeper. She moved a little freer. She let herself look at things, the sky, the mountains, Samuel's weathered face, without constantly calculating threat and escape routes. And Samuel, for his part, watched this gradual unfolding with something like reverence. He'd seen wounded animals learn to trust before, had seen how healing required patience and space, and the simple act of not causing more harm. He applied the same principles here, giving Eleanor room to discover that not every man was a predator. Not every transaction required her to surrender pieces of herself she could never get back. The town noticed, of course. The few times Samuel brought Eleanor with him for supplies, the gossip flared like wildfire in dry grass. People made their assumptions, their cruel calculations, their judgments about what really went on at the Hayes Ranch. But Samuel met every insinuation with steady silence, and Eleanor learned to walk through that crowd of whispers with her spine straight, just like she'd stood on that auction platform, not broken, just bent. 6 weeks passed, then 8, then 12. The seasons began their slow turn from summer's brutal heat toward autumn's mercy. The work changed with the weather, harvesting what little had grown, preparing for the cold months ahead, stockpiling wood and provisions against the winter that would inevitably come. And somewhere in those weeks of quiet coexistence, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single moment of revelation, but with the slow, inevitable certainty of one season becoming another. Eleanor stopped thinking of Samuel as the man who'd bought her, and started thinking of him as the man who'd asked nothing of her except to exist. And Samuel stopped seeing Eleanor as a responsibility he'd taken on, and started seeing her as someone whose presence made the silence of his house a little less empty. Neither of them spoke of this change. Neither of them named it or examined it or tried to define its boundaries. They just let it happen, the way you let seeds grow, not by forcing them, but by providing the right conditions and then getting out of the way. But even gentle transformations have their costs, and both Eleanor and Samuel carried debts from their pasts that would eventually come due. The question wasn't whether those old wounds would resurface, it was when and what would happen when they did. The answer came with the first storm of autumn, when the sky turned the color of old bruises and the wind began to howl like all the ghosts they'd both been trying to outrun. The weather changed the way trouble always changes, gradually at first, then all at once. Samuel had been watching the sky for 2 days, reading the signs the way his father had taught him and his father's father before that. The clouds built themselves into towers of slate and iron, and the air grew heavy with the weight of what was coming. Animals knew it too. The cattle bunched together in the low places, the chickens refused to leave their coop, even the wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. Eleanor felt it in her bones, that old familiar dread that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the knowledge that peace never lasted, that something always came to shatter whatever fragile safety you managed to build. She moved through the day preparing for disaster the way she'd learned to prepare all her life, securing what could be secured, accepting what couldn't, steeling herself for loss. By late afternoon, the storm was a solid wall on the western horizon, moving toward them with the inevitability of judgment. Samuel worked quickly, bringing tools into the barn, reinforcing the chicken coop, making sure the animals had shelter and water. Eleanor helped without being asked, her movements efficient and practiced. Someone who'd weathered many storms, literal and otherwise, and knew how to survive them. They worked side by side in that strange harmony they'd developed, each anticipating the other's needs, each carrying more than their share without complaint. The first drops fell like warnings, heavy and cold and spaced far enough apart that you could count them. Then the wind arrived, and counting became impossible. It hit the ranch like something alive and angry, tearing at the buildings, screaming through every gap and crack, turning the world into a chaos of noise and fury. The rain followed, not falling so much as being thrown sideways, millions of tiny weapons battering everything in their path. Thunder rolled across the flatlands like artillery fire, and lightning turned night into day in stuttering, violent flashes. Samuel and Eleanor made it to the house just as the storm reached its full fury. They stood in the kitchen, soaked and breathing hard, and watched through the window as the world outside became unknowable. Just darkness and rage, and the terrible sound of things breaking. The roof began to leak in a dozen places. Eleanor moved through the house with pots and buckets, catching water, while Samuel checked the windows and doors, making sure nothing gave way under the assault. They were good in crisis, both of them. Steady when steadiness mattered most, functional when function was the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. Then came the sound that changed everything. A massive crack like the world splitting open, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the entire house. Part of the barn roof had torn away and was now a missile in the wind, smashing against the side of the house, threatening to take out the wall of Eleanor's small room. Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, intending to secure what could be secured before more damage was done. Eleanor caught his arm. Her eyes said everything her mouth wouldn't. Don't. It's not worth it. I've lost rooms before and survived. But Samuel shook his head with that same quiet determination that defined him. This was his land, his responsibility, his way of protecting what little he had left. He pulled away gently and stepped out into the storm. Eleanor stood at the window, watching his shape disappear into the darkness and rain, and felt something crack inside her chest that had nothing to do with buildings or weather. She recognized this feeling, this sudden, desperate fear for someone else's safety, and realized with shocking clarity that somewhere in these months of careful distance she'd started to care about Samuel Hayes in a way that made his survival matter more than her own comfort. Minutes passed like hours. The storm raged. Eleanor paced the kitchen, watching the window, counting seconds between lightning flashes, trying to calculate how long was too long. How long before worry became action? How long before she had to go out there and find him? Then she saw it, Samuel's shape in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, his coat torn, his face pale, his left arm hanging at an angle that wasn't natural. He'd secured the loose roof panel, but something had struck him in the process. A piece of flying debris, a falling timber, some random act of violence the storm had visited upon him. Eleanor was there immediately, catching him as he stumbled inside, helping him to a chair, her hands already checking for damage with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd tended many wounds in her young life. His arm was broken, maybe his ribs too, and there was a gash along his temple that bled with the stubborn persistence of head wounds. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound, binding his ribs, fashioning a sling from a torn sheet. Samuel watched her through pain-narrowed eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time how capable she was, how much strength lived in this young woman he'd thought he was saving. He'd been a fool to think she needed saving. She'd been saving herself all along, every single day of her life. The storm continued its assault through the night. Eleanor stayed with Samuel, watching for signs of worsening injury, making sure he stayed conscious, refusing to let him slip away into darkness. She talked to him, really talked to him for the first time, not about the weather or the ranch or the surface things they'd been trading back and forth for months. She told him about her mother, not the woman who'd sold her at auction, but the woman she'd been before that, before life had worn her down to nothing but survival and resentment. She told him about sisters she'd lost track of, about men who'd rented her labor and taken more than they'd paid for, about a childhood that had ended before it properly began. And Samuel, through his pain and exhaustion, told her about his wife, Rachel, who'd loved this land almost as much as she'd loved him, who'd died in childbirth, along with the son they'd named Thomas, who'd left him alone in this house with nothing but work and memory and the slow erosion of hope. He told her how he'd stood at that auction, not looking for anything except maybe a way to do something right for once. To use what little power he had to end someone's suffering instead of ignoring it. The confessions came in the darkness between lightning flashes, in the pauses between thunder rolls, in that strange intimacy that crisis creates when people are stripped down to their foundations. They spoke of pain and loss, and the thousand small ways life teaches you that wanting isn't enough, that love doesn't protect you, that sometimes the only victory available is simply surviving one more day. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The wind died to whispers, the rain softened to a gentle patter. The world emerged from chaos, looking battered but intact, scarred but standing. Samuel slept finally, exhausted by pain and confession. Eleanor sat beside him in the growing light, watching his chest rise and fall, studying the lines of his face that spoke of decades of carrying weight. She thought about what he'd said, that he'd bought her not as property, but as an ending, a way to stop the cycle of her being used and discarded and sold again. For the first time, she let herself believe it might be true. For the first time, she let herself imagine that maybe, this strange arrangement they'd fallen into could become something more than just survival. Maybe it could become choice. Maybe it could become home. But first, there were questions that needed asking. First, there were truths that needed speaking. First, Eleanor needed to understand exactly what Samuel thought he'd bought at that auction, and what he expected from her now that months had passed and proximity had become something almost like partnership. The conversation that would change everything was coming. Both of them could feel it building like another storm on the horizon. But unlike the weather, this storm might actually lead to clearing, to understanding, to the kind of honesty that either destroys everything or builds something strong enough to last. Samuel woke to afternoon light and the smell of coffee and the dull ache of his broken body, reminding him that he wasn't as young as he used to be. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of her own coffee, her eyes fixed on something outside the window, or maybe on nothing at all, maybe just on the thoughts that had been building in her mind while she waited for him to wake. She heard him stirring and turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The house around them showed the storm's impact, water stains on the ceiling, debris scattered across the floor, that persistent drip, drip, drip from the leak above Eleanor's room that Samuel would need to fix once his body allowed. But they were alive, and the damage was repairable, and that counted for something in a world that seemed determined to take everything and give back nothing but lessons in endurance. Samuel tried to rise from the chair where he'd spent the night, and pain flared through his ribs like fire. Eleanor was there immediately, not touching him, but present, ready to help if he needed it, ready to step back if he didn't. That balance between care and respect for autonomy, that was the dance they'd learned together, and it had become so natural, neither of them thought about it anymore. He managed to stand, managed to make his way to the table, managed to sit across from Eleanor with only a few sharp intakes of breath to mark the cost. She poured him coffee without asking if he wanted it. She knew he wanted it, same way she knew he took it black, same way she knew 100 other small details about him that came from months of quiet observation. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee, listening to the sounds of the world recovering from the night's violence. Birds were starting to sing again, tentative at first, then more confident. The wind had gentled into something almost kind. Everything was finding its way back to normal. Everything except the tension between them, which felt like a living thing, waiting to be acknowledged. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was steady but quiet, the voice of someone who'd made a decision and was seeing it through regardless of consequences. She said his name, Samuel, and in the way she said it, he heard everything that was coming. She needed to know, she told him, needed to understand what he thought had happened at that auction, what he believed he'd purchased, what he expected from her now and in all the days to come. She'd spent 3 months waiting for the truth to reveal itself, waiting for his real intentions to surface, waiting for the kindness to curdle into demands. But the waiting had become its own form of torture, and she couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. Samuel listened to her questions, with his eyes on his coffee cup, with his broken arm aching in its sling, with all his exhaustion and pain making it impossible to hide behind the careful distance he usually maintained. The storm had stripped something away from both of them, some protective layer they'd both been wearing, and now there was nothing to do but speak the truth plainly. He told her he'd bought her freedom, not her servitude. Told her the money he'd paid was the price to end the auction, to prevent some other man from taking her home with expectations she'd be forced to fulfill. Told her he'd watched his own wife be used by this hard land and harder life, watched her be worn down by work and want, and the endless demands placed on women's bodies and spirits, and he'd sworn, after she died, that he'd never be complicit in that kind of erosion again. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her hands still wrapped around that coffee cup like it was an anchor keeping her tethered to the moment. When Samuel finished speaking, the silence that followed felt infinite, a vast space where his truth hung in the air, waiting to be accepted or rejected, waiting to be believed or dismissed as the kind of lie men tell when they want something but don't want to name it. Then she asked the question that mattered most. What happened next? What happened now that months had passed and they'd built this strange life together? What happened when proximity became familiarity, and familiarity became something that looked almost like belonging? Samuel took a long breath, and the pain in his ribs made him wince, but he pushed through it because some truths hurt worse when you try to avoid them. He told her that what happened next was entirely her choice. She could stay. She could go. She could remain in that small room with the door that had no lock and live out her days as someone who shared his space but owed him nothing. And here his voice got even quieter, or she could choose something else, something more, but only if that's what she wanted, only if it came from genuine desire and not from obligation or fear or the terrible mathematics of survival. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of being offered something she'd never had before, the ability to choose her own life without that choice being shaped by desperation or violence or the cold reality of having nowhere else to go. She told him she'd been trying to leave for weeks now, trying to convince herself that staying was dangerous, that trusting him was foolish, that this whole arrangement would eventually reveal itself as another form of captivity. She'd lain awake at night planning her escape, where she'd go, how she'd survive, what she'd do when the small amount of money she'd managed to save ran out. But every morning she'd wake up and find herself still there, still in that small room, still making coffee in Samuel's kitchen, still tending the garden and feeding the chickens and fixing the 1,000 small things that needed fixing around a ranch that was always half broken and half mended. And she'd realized, slowly and with great resistance, that she wasn't staying because she had no choice. She was staying because she was choosing to stay. The difference between those two things, the chasm between compulsion and choice, that was everything. Samuel nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. Maybe he'd been making the same choice every day too, choosing to maintain that respectful distance, choosing to offer space instead of demands, choosing to build something based on mutual regard instead of the power imbalance that had brought them together. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the storm-damaged land, at the work that would need to be done, at the life that stretched ahead of them full of uncertainty and hardship, and the daily struggle that defined existence on the frontier. Then she turned back to Samuel and said the words that would change everything. She wanted to stay. Not as someone paying off a debt or fulfilling an obligation, not as hired help or as property or as any of the other degrading categories the world tried to force women into. She wanted to stay as someone who was choosing this life, this land, this man who'd shown her that kindness didn't have to be a prelude to cruelty. But, and here her voice got fierce. She needed him to understand something. She'd been sold too many times in too many ways. She'd had her choices stripped away by people who claimed they knew better, who claimed they were protecting her, who claimed their control was for her own good. If she stayed, it had to be as an equal. It had to be as someone with voice and vote, and the absolute right to change her mind if this stopped being what she wanted. Samuel looked at her standing there in the afternoon light, this young woman who'd survived more than most people face in a lifetime. And he saw her clearly, for the first time, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who'd been saving herself all along and was now offering to save him too if he was willing to let her. He said yes. Not to ownership, not to traditional marriage with all its implied hierarchies and obligations, but yes to partnership. Yes to building something together. Yes to facing whatever came next side by side instead of in their separate corners of loneliness. They stood there looking at each other across the kitchen, and something settled between them, an understanding, an agreement, a foundation upon which something new could be built. Neither of them smiled, neither of them moved to embrace, neither of them pretended this was some kind of romantic transformation where pain became joy and struggle became ease. They both knew better. They both understood that what they were choosing was work, the hard, daily work of building trust and maintaining respect and honoring each other's autonomy, even when it would be easier to slip into old patterns of dominance and submission. But they also understood that this work, this choice to do the work, that was the only thing worth doing. Everything else was just survival. This was actually living. Eleanor went to her small room and gathered her few possessions, not to leave, but to carry them to Samuel's room, the larger room, the one with windows facing both east and west, the one that would now belong to both of them. Samuel watched her move through the house with that same steady purpose she brought to everything, and he understood that she wasn't just moving belongings. She was claiming space, asserting her right to occupy fully and completely, refusing to remain in the margins of someone else's life. That night, they ate dinner together at the table, not on opposite sides, but sitting close, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, close enough that they could feel each other's presence as something tangible and real. They talked about practical things, what needed fixing, what needed planting, how to make the ranch more than just a place where two people barely scraped by. But underneath the practical talk was something else, a current of possibility, a sense that they were building toward something neither of them could quite name yet, but both of them could feel. It wasn't romance exactly. It wasn't passion or grand gestures, or any of the things stories usually claim happen when two people decide to build a life together. It was quieter than that, more honest than that, more like two people who'd been fighting alone for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside them, to have someone share the weight, to have someone choose them not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. There was no ceremony in the traditional sense. No preacher, no church, no gathering of witnesses to mark the occasion with official blessing. What there was instead was a morning in late autumn when the air had turned crisp and the leaves had started their slow surrender to winter. Samuel and Eleanor stood together in the yard, looking at the land that had become theirs, not through legal papers or formal agreements, but through the simple act of choosing it, of committing to it, of deciding that this hard ground was where they'd make their stand. Samuel had asked if she wanted to go into town, to have something official, something recognized by law and church and community. Eleanor had shaken her head with that quiet certainty she'd developed, that knowing of her own mind that came from finally having permission to trust her own judgment. She told him that towns and churches and legal papers, those were the same institutions that had allowed her to be sold like livestock. Those were the systems that had looked at her and seen property rather than person. She didn't need their blessing on what she and Samuel were building. In fact, she'd prefer they keep their opinions to themselves. What she wanted instead was something simple, something honest, something that belonged only to them. So they stood in the yard that autumn morning, and Samuel took Eleanor's hands, gently, always gently, with the same respect he'd shown her from the beginning, and he made his promises. Not the traditional vows with their talk of obedience and submission, but new vows, honest vows, vows that acknowledged what they were actually doing here. He promised to honor her autonomy, to respect her choices, to remember every day that she'd chosen to stay and could choose to leave, and that his job was to make sure staying remained a choice she wanted to keep making. He promised to build with her, not for her, to share the weight rather than assign it, to treat her always as an equal partner in this strange enterprise of making a life together. Eleanor listened to his words, and her eyes were dry but intense, burning with the weight of what was happening. When he finished, she made her own promises in return. She promised to be honest, even when honesty was hard, to tell him when the old fears came back, when the past tried to reclaim her, when she needed space to remember who she was apart from anyone else. She promised to work beside him, to carry her share and sometimes more, but never to mistake work for worth, never to let herself be defined only by what she could produce. Most importantly, and here her voice got fierce again, that fierceness that said she'd survived too much to settle for half-truths. She promised to tell him if this stopped being what she wanted, to give him the same honesty about her changing heart that she expected from him about his, because a choice made once wasn't a choice that lasted forever. Choice had to be renewed day after day, or it stopped being choice and became just another form of obligation. Samuel agreed to this, agreed that their commitment was conditional on both of them continuing to choose it. Agreed that love, if that's what this was becoming, had to be something freely given and freely maintained, or it wasn't love at all. They sealed these promises not with a kiss, but with a simple clasp of hands, a grip that said, "I've got you, and you've got me, and we'll face whatever comes together until one or both of us decides otherwise." It was the most honest wedding ceremony the frontier had ever witnessed, though the only witnesses were the wind and the land and the stubborn chickens scratching in the yard. Afterward, they went about their day like any other day. There was work to be done. The ranch didn't care about vows or promises or the quiet revolutions happening in people's hearts. Fences needed mending. Animals needed tending. The approaching winter needed preparing for with the same grim determination that marked all preparation for Montana winters. But something had shifted. Something fundamental had changed in the way they moved around each other. Before, there had always been that careful distance, that awareness of boundaries, that conscious effort not to presume or impose. Now, while they still maintained respect for each other's space, there was also a new ease, a freedom to stand close, to touch casually, to exist in each other's orbit without constant vigilance about what it meant. Eleanor found herself singing while she worked. Nothing elaborate, just old folk songs her grandmother had taught her before the world had taken even that small joy away. Samuel heard her voice drifting across the yard and felt something loosen in his chest. Some knot of grief he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. They ate their meals together now, without the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on every silence. They talked about small things and large things with equal comfort. The weather, the cattle, the memories they'd both been carrying, the dreams they'd thought they'd lost the right to have. Samuel told stories about his father and the ranch when it had been thriving instead of merely surviving. Eleanor spoke more freely about her sisters, wondering aloud where they'd ended up, whether they'd found safety or just different forms of struggle. At night, they shared the larger bedroom, not with the urgency of newlyweds, but with the quiet comfort of two people who'd chosen to occupy the same space. They lay in the darkness talking until sleep claimed them, or sometimes just lying in silence that felt full instead of empty. The intimacy between them grew slowly, carefully, with the same respect for boundaries and consent that had defined everything else about their relationship. Samuel learned that Eleanor flinched at sudden movements even months after leaving the auction behind. Eleanor learned that Samuel sometimes woke in the night calling for Rachel and had to remember all over again that she was gone. They gave each other permission for these wounds, these remnants of past pain, understanding that healing wasn't linear. It was a path that doubled back on itself, that required patience and forgiveness, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when the choosing was hard. The first snow came in November, soft and tentative, dusting the world in white that wouldn't last. Eleanor stood at the window, watching it fall, and Samuel came to stand beside her. Close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that she could feel his warmth, close enough that she didn't feel alone in facing the winter ahead. He asked her if she was afraid, not of him. He knew that fear had mostly faded, but of the winter, of the isolation, of the long months when the cold would trap them on this ranch with only each other for company. It was a legitimate question. Many partnerships that seemed solid in summer's ease fell apart under winter's pressure. Eleanor considered the question honestly. She always tried to be honest now, tried to honor that promise she'd made. She told him yes, she was afraid. Afraid that the closeness would become claustrophobic. Afraid that the old patterns would reassert themselves when there was nowhere to escape to. Afraid that she'd wake up one morning and realize she'd traded one form of captivity for another, prettier cage. And here she turned to look at him directly, her eyes meeting his without flinching. She was also hopeful. Hopeful that they'd built something strong enough to withstand pressure. Hopeful that their honesty with each other was a better foundation than most marriages ever got. Hopeful that she'd finally found a place where she could weather the storms, both the literal ones and the ones that lived inside her, without having to weather them alone. Samuel nodded, accepting her fear as valid, accepting her hope as hard-won rather than naive. He told her his own fear, that he'd fail her somehow, that his old habits would surface, that he'd wake up one day and realize he'd become like all the other men who'd claimed to offer something better, while still expecting women to make themselves smaller to fit into the spaces men provided. They stood there together, facing their fears out loud, and somehow that made them less terrible. The naming of the thing, the speaking of the dread, that act alone stripped away some of the power fear held. Winter descended properly in December, and it came with the brutal honesty Montana winters always brought. The temperature dropped until breathing hurt. The snow fell and kept falling until the world became nothing but white. The wind howled around the house like something trying to get in, trying to find the cracks in their walls, trying to test whether what they'd built could withstand assault. Samuel and Eleanor faced it together. They rose before dawn to break ice in the water troughs. They bundled against the cold to feed animals that looked at them with patient accusation, as if to say, "Why do you humans insist on living in places where nothing should live?" They worked side by side in conditions that would have broken either of them alone, but became merely difficult when shared. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the cold had been held at bay for another day, they sat by the fire and discovered what it meant to simply be with another person, not to perform or produce or prove anything, just to exist in each other's presence and find that presence comforting rather than threatening. Samuel taught Eleanor to read the land even in winter, how to spot where animals had passed, how to predict storms by the quality of light, how to find beauty in the stark landscape when beauty seemed impossible. Eleanor taught Samuel things she didn't even know she was teaching, how to laugh again, how to look forward instead of constantly back, how to believe that good things could last without immediately waiting for them to be taken away. The townspeople barely saw them that winter. Samuel made only necessary trips for supplies, and Eleanor often stayed home, not hiding, but simply choosing not to subject herself to the gossip and speculation that followed them everywhere. Let the town think what it wanted. Let them make their assumptions and pass their judgments. Out here on the ranch, beyond the reach of those voices, Samuel and Eleanor were building something that didn't require anyone else's approval. Christmas came and went with simple observance, a better meal than usual, small gifts exchanged more for the gesture than the objects themselves. Samuel had carved Eleanor a small wooden box with surprising delicacy for hands so rough and scarred. Eleanor had mended and altered one of Rachel's old dresses, not to replace her, never to replace her, but to honor the memory by giving the dress new life instead of letting it gather dust in a trunk. New Year arrived, and with it came the understanding that they'd survived the hardest test, not the winter itself, but the intimacy it forced, the proximity it demanded, the way it stripped away all distractions and left only the raw truth of whether two people could actually stand to be together when there was nowhere else to go. They'd passed. They'd more than passed. They'd discovered that what they'd built wasn't just sustainable, it was actually good. Not perfect, never perfect, but good in the way that mattered. Good in the sense that each of them was more themselves together than they'd been apart. Good in the sense that the weight of living was lighter when shared, even when the sharing meant also sharing the burden of each other's wounds and fears and damaged places. By February, the worst of winter's fury had spent itself. The days grew imperceptibly longer. The sun, when it appeared, held actual warmth instead of just light. The land began its slow preparation for spring, and Samuel and Eleanor began planning for the year ahead, what to plant, what to repair, what to build, that would make the ranch more than just a place where two people barely survived. They talked about the future now, not just the immediate future of next week or next month, but the longer stretches of time that only people who believed in their own continuity allowed themselves to imagine. Samuel spoke carefully about the possibility of cattle, of slowly rebuilding the herd his grief had let dwindle. Eleanor spoke even more carefully about the possibility of being part of the community again, not on the town's terms, but on her own. And one night, with the fire burning low and the wind outside gentled into something almost kind, Eleanor spoke about the possibility that had been growing in her mind for weeks. She told Samuel that she wanted to help others the way he'd helped her. wanted to find the girls at auctions or in workhouses or in situations where their choices had been stripped away, wanted to offer them what Samuel had offered her, a chance to choose their own path forward, even if that path led away from the ranch and towards something else entirely. Samuel listened to this dream with seriousness it deserved. He understood that Eleanor wasn't just talking about charity. She was talking about justice, about using whatever small power they had to disrupt the systems that treated women as commodities, about creating a network of safety in a world designed to be unsafe for anyone without money or power or protection. It would be dangerous, he warned her. The people who profited from selling girls wouldn't take kindly to interference. The townspeople who saw nothing wrong with the auction system would call them troublemakers. Or worse, they'd make enemies of people who already viewed them with suspicion. Eleanor met his warnings with that same fierceness she'd shown when making her vows. She knew the risks, had lived the consequences of disrupting power structures. But she also knew that remaining silent, remaining safe, that was its own form of death. She'd been given a second chance at life, and she couldn't in good conscience keep that gift to herself while others suffered what she'd suffered. Samuel looked at this young woman who'd grown into her full strength right before his eyes, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the possessive pride of ownership, but the genuine pride of witnessing someone become fully themselves. He told her yes. Yes, they'd find a way to help. Yes, they'd take the risks. Yes, they'd build something bigger than just their own survival. Because that's what people who'd found genuine partnership did. They didn't just build for themselves. They built for the world they wanted to exist in. They created the safety they'd needed and then extended it to others who still waited in the cold and the dark. Winter began its slow retreat. The snow started to melt. The ice broke. The world prepared itself for renewal. And inside the weathered house on the Hayes Ranch, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances prepared themselves to do something neither of them could have imagined at that dusty auction months ago. They prepared to build something that mattered, something that would outlast them, something that would prove that broken people could heal, that choice could be restored, that love, real love, based on respect and equality and mutual support, that kind of love could actually exist in a world that seemed designed to make it impossible. Spring was coming, and with it, everything would change. March arrived with false promises and true warnings, days warm enough to believe winter had surrendered, followed by nights that reminded you the cold always kept reserves in reserve. Eleanor and Samuel used those shifting days to prepare for the season ahead. The ranch needed everything a place needs after barely surviving winter: repairs and reinforcements, and the kind of hard work that left you exhausted in a way that felt honest instead of defeating. They worked dawn to dusk, their movements synchronized now, their communication requiring fewer words and more understanding of shared purpose. But Eleanor was also preparing for something else, something that had been growing in her mind through all those long winter nights, something that required more than just physical labor. It required planning and courage and the willingness to make herself visible in ways she'd been avoiding. She told Samuel one morning over coffee that she was ready to go into town, not just for supplies, not just as the silent figure standing beside him while others whispered. She wanted to go as herself, speak to people directly, start building the connections they'd need if they were going to help girls, like she'd been. Samuel studied her face for signs of doubt or fear, but found only determination. He asked if she was certain. The town had long memories and longer tongues, and once she made herself visible, she couldn't take that visibility back. Once she claimed space, people would have opinions about it. Eleanor's laugh was short, but genuine. Let them have opinions, she said. Opinions couldn't hurt her anymore. She'd survived far worse than other people's disapproval. What could hurt her was staying small, staying silent, staying safe, while others suffered because she was too afraid to stand up. They rode into town together on a Saturday in late March, when the main street would be busy with people doing their weekly business. Eleanor wore one of the dresses she'd altered, simple but clean, respectable but not apologetic. Her hair was pulled back, practical and neat. She sat straight in the wagon seat, her spine showing that same strength she'd had on the auction platform, except now it came from choice rather than defiance. The whispers started before they'd even tied up the horses. Eleanor could feel the eyes on her, hear the low buzz of speculation and judgment. She'd expected it, had prepared for it. She took Samuel's offered hand to step down from the wagon, not because she needed the help, but because the gesture showed partnership, showed that Samuel Hayes stood beside her by choice, that whatever relationship they'd built wasn't something she'd been forced into. They split up to handle their separate errands. Samuel to the feed store and the bank, Eleanor to the general store, and then, more significantly, to the church. The general store fell silent when Eleanor entered. The proprietor's wife, Martha Henshaw, looked up from her counter with undisguised surprise. Other women shopping there froze in place, watching to see what would happen, whether Eleanor would be served or turned away, whether the unspoken rules about people like her would be enforced or ignored. Eleanor met Martha's eyes directly. She offered a polite greeting, civil but not subservient, friendly but not desperate for approval. She made her small purchases with money Samuel had insisted she keep for herself, money that was hers to spend as she chose. She conducted her business with quiet dignity, not rushing, not apologizing for taking up space. Martha served her, not warmly, but she served her. It was a small victory, barely worth noting except that it was the first crack in the wall of social exclusion the town had built around Eleanor. The first acknowledgement that maybe, this girl who'd been sold at auction deserved to be treated like a human being buying flour and thread. When Eleanor left the general store, she walked across the street to the church. The building stood white and weathered, its steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusation or a promise, depending on your relationship with divine justice. Eleanor had none. Her relationship with God had been complicated by too many prayers that went unanswered. Too many times she'd needed divine intervention and received only silence. But the church wasn't just a building. It was where Reverend Thomas Warren lived in the small house behind it, and Reverend Warren was the man Eleanor needed to see. She knocked on his door with confidence she didn't entirely feel. The Reverend answered, his weathered face showing surprise at finding her on his doorstep. He was an older man, 60 at least, with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly. The tremor of age or drink or some lingering illness Eleanor couldn't identify. She introduced herself properly, not as the girl Samuel Hayes bought, but as Eleanor Hayes, partner to Samuel in the ranch outside town. She told the Reverend she needed to speak with him about matters of community welfare, about women and girls in difficult situations, about the possibility of creating something, a network, a system, that might offer alternatives to the auction block and the workhouse, and the countless other ways desperate people got used by those with power over them. Reverend Warren listened with careful attention. He invited her inside, that simple act of hospitality already more than she'd expected. They sat in his modest parlor, and Eleanor laid out her vision with surprising clarity for someone who'd spent most of her life having others speak for her. She told him about the auction, about what it felt like to stand there and be evaluated like livestock, about the men who'd looked at her and seen only utility, only what she could provide for them. She didn't spare the details, didn't make it easier for him to hear. She needed him to understand the full weight of what she was asking him to help dismantle. Then she told him about Samuel, about how one act of basic human decency, buying her freedom instead of buying her labor, had changed everything, about how she'd been given the chance to choose her life and how that choice had saved her in ways that went deeper than mere survival. She wanted to create that possibility for others, she told him. She and Samuel had little, barely enough to keep their own ranch running, but they had space, they had willingness, they had the hard-won understanding of what it meant to rebuild yourself after the world tried to convince you there was nothing worth rebuilding. If the Reverend could help her identify girls in trouble, if he could connect her with families who might need temporary help, or children who needed teaching, if he could help her build a network of people willing to offer alternatives to the traditional ways women and girls got trapped in cycles of exploitation. She trailed off, watching his face for signs of dismissal or disgust, or the patronizing patience men often showed when women suggested they understood anything about how the world worked. Instead, Reverend Warren asked her questions. Real questions about her plans for housing, about how she'd support girls who came to stay, about what happened if families objected or if the people who profited from the current system pushed back. He wasn't dismissing her idea. He was testing its foundations, making sure she'd thought it through. Eleanor answered each question with honesty about what she knew and what she didn't. She admitted the plan was still forming, that she didn't have all the answers, that she was probably naive about how hard this would be. But she also told him that doing nothing felt like betrayal. Betrayal of herself, of the girls still standing on auction platforms, of every woman who'd been told her only value was in what she could do for others. The Reverend sat in silence for a long moment after Eleanor finished speaking. Then he did something unexpected. He told her about his own daughter, a girl who died young, not even 15, after being married off to a man 3 times her age. A marriage the Reverend himself had performed, believing he was securing her future, not realizing he was signing her death warrant. He'd spent every day since then wondering if he could have done something different, wondering if his adherence to tradition, his belief that the established ways were the right ways, wondering if that had made him complicit in his daughter's suffering. He told Eleanor he'd help, not just with words or vague encouragement, but with actual assistance. He knew families who might be open to new arrangements. He knew girls in situations that everyone pretended not to see. He knew the systems that kept everything trapped in place, and he was tired, so tired, of maintaining them. Together, they could build something different, something that offered alternatives, something that said to the young women of this territory, you have worth beyond your labor, you have the right to choose, you don't have to accept exploitation as the price of survival. Eleanor left the Reverend's house with more than she'd hoped for. She'd expected resistance, skepticism, the 1,000 reasons why things couldn't change. Instead, she'd found an ally. Someone with influence in the community, someone who understood that their current systems were broken and needed more than minor adjustments. They needed revolution, even if that revolution came in small, quiet forms. She met Samuel back at the wagon, and he could see immediately that something had shifted. She told him about the conversation, about the Reverend's unexpected support, about the possibility that maybe they weren't alone in this. Maybe there were others who'd been waiting for someone to say out loud what they'd been thinking in private. The ride home was lighter than the ride in had been. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since before the auction. Hope that wasn't fragile or desperate, but hope built on actual foundation. Hope that came from taking action instead of just wishing things were different. Over the following weeks, Reverend Warren sent word when he identified situations that needed intervention. A girl of 16 being pressured into marriage with a man known for violent tempers. A woman recently widowed being forced from her home by in-laws who wanted the property. 2 sisters whose father had died, leaving them at the mercy of creditors who saw opportunity in their vulnerability. Eleanor and Samuel responded to each situation carefully. They didn't storm in with demands or judgments. They offered alternatives, space on their ranch if needed, connection to other families who might provide work or shelter. Most importantly, they offered the radical idea that these women had the right to refuse, to say no, to choose a different path, even if that path was harder in the short term. Not everyone accepted their help. Some were too afraid of the social consequences. Some had family members who blocked access. Some simply couldn't imagine that any alternative existed to the traditional ways, no matter how painful those ways were. But some did accept. A young woman named Sarah came to stay with them for 3 months while she learned skills that would let her support herself. 2 sisters spent the winter in the small room Eleanor had once occupied, healing from their father's death and their uncle's abuse, before moving on to situations they'd chosen for themselves. The ranch became more than just Samuel and Eleanor's home. It became a way station, a place where women could catch their breath, remember their strength, prepare themselves for whatever came next. It wasn't perfect. Resources were always scarce, and every additional mouth to feed strained their limited supplies. But they made it work, the same way they made everything work, through determination and shared burden and the absolute refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable. The town's attitude toward Eleanor shifted gradually. Not everyone changed their minds. There were still plenty who saw her as troublesome, who resented her refusal to accept her place, who spread rumors about what really went on at the Hayes Ranch. But others began to respect her. Women who'd once whispered behind their hands started greeting her openly. Men who'd dismissed her started tipping their hats. Eleanor was becoming something the frontier rarely produced, a woman with agency. A woman who'd taken her suffering and transformed it into purpose, a woman who refused to let her past define her future. And Samuel watched all of this with quiet pride and the growing understanding that he hadn't saved Eleanor at that auction. She'd saved herself. He'd just been the one who'd stepped aside and given her room to do it. By summer, the Hayes Ranch had earned a reputation. Not the scandalous reputation the gossips had predicted, but something else, a reputation as a place where women could find safety, where different rules applied, where the old patterns of dominance and submission weren't automatically enforced. It wasn't the life Samuel had imagined when he'd raised his hand at that auction. It was harder, more complicated, more exposed to criticism and risk, but it was also more meaningful, more connected, more aligned with the values he'd lost sight of during his years of grief and isolation. Together, Eleanor and Samuel had built something neither of them could have built alone. They'd taken their brokenness, their pain, their hard-won understanding of what it meant to survive, and they'd transformed it into something that helped others survive too. The seeds they'd planted that spring, both in the ground and in the community, were beginning to grow. And with that growth came the realization that change, real change, didn't happen through grand gestures or dramatic moments. It happened through the daily decision to show up, to do the work, to offer alternatives, to refuse to accept that suffering was simply the way things had to be. The story of Eleanor and Samuel was becoming larger than just their own story. It was becoming a testament to what was possible when people chose compassion over comfort, when they chose action over acceptance, when they chose to build something new instead of maintaining something broken. And out on the frontier, under that vast Montana sky, in a weathered house that had learned to shelter more than just its original inhabitants, that story was still unfolding, still being written, still proving that transformation was possible for those brave enough to choose it. The letter arrived in July, carried by a circuit rider who'd been paid extra to deliver it, specifically to Eleanor Hayes, at the ranch outside town. Eleanor took the envelope with trembling hands, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden understanding that the past never stayed buried forever. No matter how far you ran, no matter how carefully you built your new life, something always came back to remind you of who you'd been before you became who you were. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The return address was from a town 3 territories over. Eleanor opened it standing in the yard while Samuel worked in the barn, and she read the words that would crack open everything they'd built. It was from one of her sisters, Anna, the second oldest of the 4 girls their mother had sold over the years. Anna had tracked Eleanor down through the network of letters and rumors that connected frontier towns, through the whispered stories about the girl at the Hayes Ranch who'd started helping other women escape their circumstances. Anna's letter was brief and desperate. She'd been sold to a mining family 10 years ago, had worked herself nearly to death in their service, had finally managed to escape but had nowhere to go. She was hiding in a boarding house, using the last of her saved money, and she needed help. She needed a place where she could rest and heal and figure out what came next. She was asking Eleanor, her little sister, the one she remembered as a child with bright eyes and quick laughter, if there was room for one more at the ranch that had become legend among women trying to survive on the frontier. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before her hands stopped shaking. Then she walked to the barn where Samuel was repairing harness leather, and she handed him the letter without saying anything. Sometimes words weren't adequate for the size of what you needed to communicate. Samuel read it slowly, his weathered face showing the careful thought he brought to everything important. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor and asked the only question that mattered. What did she want to do? Eleanor's answer came without hesitation. She wanted to say yes, wanted to bring Anna here, wanted to help her sister the way she'd been helped, and here her voice wavered. But Anna was different from the other women who'd come to stay. Anna was family. Anna had memories of Eleanor as a child, knew her before she'd become this person who'd survived the auction and built this new life. Anna would see her clearly in ways others couldn't, would know every weakness and failure and moment of fear that Eleanor had been hiding behind competence and strength, would remember the girl she'd been and possibly question the woman she'd become. Samuel understood immediately. He asked Eleanor if she was ashamed of who she'd been, if she wanted to hide her past from someone who'd lived it alongside her. The question hit hard because it was the right question. Eleanor had been working so hard to be strong, to be the person others could lean on, to embody the transformation she wanted to offer others. She'd been performing competence, and the thought of someone who knew she'd once been vulnerable and frightened and small, that thought was terrifying. But she also knew that hiding from Anna meant hiding from herself, meant pretending that transformation was about erasing who you'd been instead of integrating all your pieces, the broken parts and the healed parts and the parts still mending, into something whole. She told Samuel to write back, tell Anna to come, tell her the ranch had room for one more, tell her that Eleanor remembered her too, remembered a sister who'd tried to protect her when they were young, remembered someone who'd shown her kindness in a house where kindness was scarce. The response was sent, and then came the waiting to see if Anna would actually come, waiting to face someone who'd known her before, who'd witnessed her at her weakest, who might look at everything Eleanor had built and see only the frightened girl underneath. Anna arrived 3 weeks later, riding in on a supply wagon, looking like she'd been worn down to her bones. She was 30 years old, but looked 50. Her face lined with exhaustion, her hands scarred from years of brutal labor, her eyes holding the same haunted quality Eleanor saw in the mirror on her hardest days. The 2 sisters stood in the yard, looking at each other across a decade of separation and suffering. Neither knew quite how to bridge that distance. Too much had happened, too much had changed, and yet somehow they were still connected by blood and memory and the shared experience of being sold by the woman who should have protected them. Eleanor moved first. She crossed the space between them and embraced Anna, not gently, but fiercely, holding on like she could transfer strength through sheer force of will. Anna collapsed into that embrace and wept, the kind of crying that comes from finally reaching safety. After running for so long, you forgot what safety felt like. Samuel gave them space. He understood this reunion needed privacy, needed the sisters to reconnect without an audience. He took the supply wagon to the barn and busied himself with tasks that kept him visible but not intrusive. Eleanor led Anna into the house, into the home she'd built with Samuel, into the space that had become her sanctuary. She showed Anna to the small room that now served as temporary housing for women who needed it. The same room Eleanor had occupied when she'd first arrived, the room that represented choice and safety and the beginning of transformation. Anna sat on the narrow bed and looked around at the simple space with something like wonder. She told Eleanor she'd been expecting something different, had been afraid that the stories about the Hayes Ranch were exaggerated, or that Eleanor had simply traded one form of servitude for another, prettier version. But she could see the truth in the house itself, in the way Eleanor moved through it with confidence, in the unlocked doors, in the absence of fear that Anna could sense, despite her own exhaustion. Whatever Eleanor had here, it was real, it was chosen, it was not another cage. The sisters talked for hours that first day. They spoke about their other sisters, Marie and Catherine, wondering where they'd ended up, whether they'd survived their own sales, whether they'd found any measure of peace or just different forms of struggle. They spoke about their mother, and both of them found they felt less anger than they'd expected, mostly just sad exhaustion at the thought of a woman so broken by her own life that she'd broken her daughters too. Anna told her story. 10 years with a mining family that had worked her mercilessly, beating her when she slowed, denying her food when she protested, keeping her isolated from anyone who might question how they treated their hired help. She'd finally escaped when the family patriarch died and the sons started fighting over the property, had slipped away in the chaos and never looked back. Eleanor listened without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize or offer empty comfort. She just heard Anna's story the way she wanted her own story to be heard, as truth that deserved acknowledgement, as pain that deserved recognition, as survival that deserved respect. And when Anna finished, she looked at Eleanor with eyes that held both hope and fear. She asked the question Eleanor had been dreading. Had Eleanor really found something different here? Or was she just better at pretending? Was Samuel Hayes truly the exception everyone claimed? Or was this all an elaborate performance they'd all discover was false once the mask slipped? Eleanor took a long breath before answering. She told Anna the truth, that Samuel was different, that what they'd built was real, but that it required constant work. That she'd had to learn to trust again, had to learn to speak her needs, had to learn that accepting help wasn't the same as surrendering autonomy, that some days were hard and the old fears came back, and she had to remind herself that she was choosing to stay rather than being trapped. But yes, it was real as anything could be in a world that seemed designed to make trust and safety impossible for women without power or protection. Anna cried again, but this time from relief. Relief that maybe, there was an ending to her story that didn't involve more suffering. Maybe there was a place where she could stop running and start healing. Over the following weeks, Anna integrated into the life of the ranch. She was different from the other women who'd come to stay. Those women had been temporary, passing through on their way to other destinations. Anna was family, and that meant something different. It meant permanence. It meant belonging not just to the space, but to Eleanor herself. Samuel accepted Anna's presence with the same respect he showed everyone. He gave her space to heal, time to rest, room to discover what she wanted to do next, without pressure or expectations. He treated her as Eleanor's sister, which meant treating her as someone who mattered, someone whose well-being was connected to Eleanor's well-being. But Anna's presence also changed the dynamics of the house. She saw things others didn't see, saw the moments when Eleanor's strength was performance, saw the times when Samuel had to carefully navigate Eleanor's old fears, saw the work that went into maintaining their partnership. And seeing all of that, Anna understood something crucial. She understood that what Eleanor and Samuel had built wasn't easy. It wasn't a fairy tale where the auction ended and everyone lived happily ever after without effort. It was a daily choice to honor each other's autonomy, a constant negotiation of needs and boundaries, a continuous effort to build trust faster than trauma could erode it. And seeing that work, seeing how much effort went into maintaining something good, that actually gave Anna hope. Because if it was work, that meant it was achievable. If Eleanor had learned these skills, Anna could learn them too. If Eleanor had found the strength to build something new, Anna could find that strength in herself. One evening, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Eleanor and Samuel and Anna, three survivors finding their way towards something like peace. Anna asked them how they'd started this, how they'd gone from the auction to building something that helped others. Eleanor and Samuel exchanged a look, that wordless communication they'd developed over months of partnership. Then Eleanor told Anna the truth. They'd started by being honest about their wounds instead of hiding them. They'd started by giving each other permission to be broken without needing to be fixed. They'd started by choosing each other every day instead of assuming that one choice, once made, lasted forever. And somewhere in that daily choosing, somewhere in that honest acknowledgement of difficulty and pain, and the hard work of building trust, they'd found something worth protecting, something worth expanding, to include others who needed the same grace they'd given each other. Anna listened to this with fierce attention. Then she asked the question that had been building in her mind. Could she stay? Not just for a few weeks or months, but stay, be part of what they were building. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She looked at Samuel, not asking permission, but checking in, making sure they were aligned. Samuel nodded slightly. Whatever Eleanor decided, he'd support. Eleanor turned back to her sister and said yes. Yes, Anna could stay. Yes, she could be part of this work. Yes, she could help build something that gave other women the choices they'd all been denied. And here Eleanor's voice got firm. Staying meant committing to the same principles that governed everything they did here. Staying meant honesty even when it was hard. Staying meant respecting boundaries and autonomy. Staying meant doing the work of healing, instead of just hiding from pain. Anna agreed without hesitation. She'd spent 10 years hiding, 10 years surviving but not living, 10 years waiting for permission to be fully human again. If the price of staying was doing the hard work of healing, she'd pay it gladly. That night, after Anna had gone to bed, Eleanor and Samuel sat in their room in the darkness, not speaking, just processing what had shifted. The ranch had been their sanctuary, a place they'd built for themselves first, then gradually opened to others. But those others had always been temporary. Anna was different. Anna was permanence. Samuel asked Eleanor if she was afraid of what Anna's presence might change, if she worried that the delicate balance they'd achieved might be disrupted by someone who knew her history so intimately. Eleanor thought about the question honestly. Yes, she was afraid that Anna would see her as the little sister who needed protecting instead of the woman she'd become. Afraid that having family around would trigger old patterns of behavior she'd worked hard to leave behind. Afraid that the past, embodied in her sister's presence, would pull her backwards instead of letting her move forward. But she was also hopeful. Hopeful that Anna could become an ally in the work they were doing, hopeful that having someone who understood their history could make her feel less alone in ways even Samuel couldn't address. Hopeful that sisterhood, real sisterhood based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy, could be part of healing instead of part of wounding. Samuel wrapped his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, that casual intimacy they'd developed, that comfort with physical closeness that had taken months to build. He told her he trusted her judgment. If she believed Anna could be part of what they were building, then he'd welcome her fully. If she later changed her mind, they'd figure out what came next together. That was the foundation of everything between them: trust, flexibility, the willingness to adapt when circumstances changed. It's what made their partnership work when so many others failed under pressure. The seasons turned again. Summer gave way to autumn, and with autumn came new challenges and new growth. Anna proved herself capable beyond what anyone expected. She was strong from her years of brutal labor, but she also had a gentleness with the women who came to stay, that came from understanding their fear intimately. She became Eleanor's true partner in the work, taking on responsibilities that had been stretching Eleanor too thin. Together, the sisters created something powerful. A network of women helping women, sharing resources and information, quietly disrupting the systems that kept them trapped. Reverend Warren connected them with others across the territory who shared their vision. The ranch became a hub, a place where women could find not just temporary safety, but connections to opportunities they'd never known existed. The work was exhausting. It was emotionally draining. It required constant vigilance against those who benefited from the old systems and wanted to maintain them. But it was also meaningful in ways that simply surviving had never been. It gave all three of them, Eleanor, Samuel, and Anna, a purpose that transcended their individual pain. And in the process of building this network, of creating these alternatives, they discovered something unexpected. They discovered that healing wasn't something you did alone in isolation. Healing happened in community, in connection, in the act of helping others while being helped yourself. Every woman they assisted helped them heal a little more. Every story they heard reflected their own stories back at them in ways that made the pain more bearable because it was shared. By the time winter arrived again, the Hayes Ranch had become something legendary in whispered conversations among women across the territory. It was the place you could go when you had nowhere else. The place where different rules applied. The place where women helped each other instead of competing for scraps of male approval and protection. And at the center of it all were three people who'd learned that survival wasn't enough, that living meant choosing. And choosing meant sometimes doing things that scared you, and doing scary things meant trusting that the people beside you would catch you if you fell. Anna's presence had shifted everything, but not in the ways Eleanor had feared. Instead of pulling them backwards, Anna's arrival had pushed them forward, had expanded their capacity, had strengthened their network, had proved that family could be chosen and rebuilt on foundations of respect rather than obligation. The past had returned, but it had returned transformed, not as trauma that needed constant management, but as wisdom that informed their present, as connection that enriched their work, as proof that survival was possible and worth the effort it required. And as snow began to fall again on the Montana landscape, covering everything in white silence, the three of them sat by the fire and talked about the future, about expanding the network, about finding more allies, about creating something so strong and so widespread that women across the frontier would know they had options, had choices, had the right to refuse exploitation and demand something better. It was ambitious, probably impossible, certainly dangerous, but then again, everything worth doing usually was. The backlash began in early spring, arriving with the same inevitability as the thaw. Word had spread too far. The Hayes Ranch had become too visible. Too many women had found their way to safety through the network Eleanor and Anna had built. And when power structures are disrupted, those who benefit from them inevitably push back. It started with rumors, vicious whispers about what really went on at the ranch, implications about Samuel's character and Eleanor's morality, suggestions that the women who stayed there were being corrupted into rejecting their proper roles. The gossip was calculated and cruel, designed to undermine everything they'd built by attacking their reputations instead of their actions. Eleanor heard the rumors in town and felt the old fear rising, the fear that she'd never truly escape being seen as the girl on the auction block, that no matter what she built or who she became, her past would always be wielded as a weapon against her. But Anna reminded her of something crucial. The rumors had power only if Eleanor gave them power. The people spreading lies were afraid of what it meant that women were choosing to leave abusive situations, afraid of losing the cheap labor and control they'd always taken for granted, afraid that the old order was crumbling. "Let them be afraid," Anna said with fierce conviction. "Let them panic. Their fear meant the work was succeeding." Samuel faced his own challenges. Men at the feed store and the bank started questioning his manhood, suggesting that he'd been captured by women's schemes, that he'd forgotten his place in the natural order of things. The implications were clear. Real men controlled women, and Samuel's willingness to support Eleanor's work marked him as weak, as compromised, as betraying his own gender. Samuel absorbed these attacks with the same steady calm he brought to everything. He'd spent years alone with his grief, isolated from community. These men's opinions had no power over him. He knew what he and Eleanor had built. He knew it was right. Their disapproval was the price of integrity, and it was a price he'd pay gladly. But the backlash escalated beyond rumors. A local businessman named Cyrus Blackwood, a man who owned several properties and employed numerous young women in questionable conditions, began actively working to undermine the network. He pressured families not to seek help from the Hayes Ranch. He threatened landlords who provided temporary housing to women Eleanor connected with other opportunities. He used his influence with the sheriff to suggest that perhaps the activities at the Hayes Ranch should be investigated. Blackwood's campaign was sophisticated and dangerous. He wasn't attacking them directly. He was attacking the infrastructure they'd built, dismantling the network connection by connection, using fear and financial pressure to isolate them. Eleanor and Anna met with Reverend Warren to strategize. The Reverend's face was grave. He'd underestimated how threatened certain men would feel by women claiming autonomy. He'd thought moral argument would be enough to create change, but he was learning that power never surrenders itself peacefully. They needed more allies, Warren said. More people willing to stand publicly with them. More resources to withstand the pressure Blackwood was applying. Most importantly, they needed to document what they were doing, to show that their work was legitimate help, not the corruption Blackwood was claiming. Over the following weeks, they worked to strengthen their foundation. Eleanor began keeping careful records: who came to stay, what assistance was provided, where women went afterward. She documented success stories with permission from the women involved, creating testimony that proved their work was helping people build better lives. Anna reached out to other women across the territory, not just those needing help, but those who'd received help and were now stable. She built a network of voices willing to speak up, willing to say publicly that the Hayes Ranch had given them chances they wouldn't have had otherwise. Samuel used his own credibility, limited though it was, to speak with other ranchers and farmers. He made the practical argument. Women who had choices worked better, stayed longer, caused fewer problems than women who felt trapped. He appealed to their self-interest in a way that bypassed moral arguments they might dismiss. But despite these efforts, Blackwood's campaign was working. Families who'd once been willing to help now kept their distance. Women who might have sought assistance stayed in dangerous situations rather than risked the social consequences of being associated with the Hayes Ranch. The network that had taken months to build was fracturing under sustained pressure. Then came the threat that changed everything. A young woman named Margaret, barely 17, arrived at the ranch in the middle of the night, bleeding and terrified. She'd been working for Blackwood, living in a boarding house he owned, and when she tried to leave after he'd assaulted her, he'd had her beaten as a warning to other women who might think about defying him. Margaret had nowhere else to go. No family, no resources, no options except to run to the place she'd heard whispered about, the Hayes Ranch where women could find safety. Eleanor and Anna tended her wounds while Samuel rode into town to fetch the doctor, not because they couldn't handle the medical care themselves, but because they needed official documentation of what had been done to this girl. They needed evidence that would force the community to acknowledge what Blackwood was doing, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as more rumors and lies. The doctor came, a younger man named Daniels, who'd recently moved to town, and he examined Margaret with professional care. When he finished, his face was pale with anger. He told them plainly that Margaret's injuries were severe, that they were clearly the result of deliberate violence, and that he would document everything he'd seen. But he also warned them. Blackwood was powerful. He had connections with the territorial government. He had money to hire lawyers. Unless they had absolute proof of his involvement, he'd find ways to escape consequences. Men like Blackwood always did. Eleanor felt something harden in her chest then, a resolve that went beyond anything she'd felt before. For months, she'd been trying to help women escape bad situations through quiet resistance, through building alternatives, through offering choices. But Blackwood's assault on Margaret had crossed a line. This wasn't just exploitation, it was violence, and violence required a different response. She told the doctor they'd get proof. Whatever it took, they'd get the evidence needed to stop Blackwood from hurting anyone else. Over the next week, Eleanor and Anna became investigators. They spoke carefully with women who'd worked for Blackwood, building a pattern of behavior that showed Margaret's assault wasn't isolated. They gathered testimony from women who'd escaped his employment, documented the conditions he maintained, collected evidence of wages withheld and promises broken, and the systematic exploitation he'd built into a profitable business model. It was dangerous work. Every conversation risked exposure. Every woman who agreed to testify risked retaliation, but slowly, carefully, they built a case, not just against Blackwood's assault on Margaret, but against the entire system of exploitation he represented. Samuel, meanwhile, worked a different angle. He approached other businessmen in town, men who competed with Blackwood, men who resented his growing power, men whose own interests might be served by seeing him fall. He made alliances with people he didn't particularly like, using Blackwood's overreach as an opportunity to undermine him in ways that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with business competition. The pragmatism of it disturbed Samuel. He'd have preferred to defeat Blackwood through moral argument, but Eleanor reminded him that justice didn't care about motives. If greedy men would help them stop a predator because it served their own interests, she'd take that help and not waste time wishing it came from nobler sources. Reverend Warren used his position to speak more forcefully from the pulpit. He preached about exploitation and violence against the vulnerable. He quoted scripture about defending the widow and the orphan and the stranger. He made it clear that remaining silent in the face of injustice was its own form of sin. Not everyone listened. Many in his congregation were uncomfortable with his direction, preferred when religion stayed safely abstract rather than pointing at specific sins in their own community. But some did listen. Some began to question their previous assumptions. Some started to see that the social order they'd always accepted as natural was actually carefully constructed to benefit certain people at the expense of others. The pressure built on both sides. Blackwood intensified his campaign, using every tool available to powerful men. Financial pressure, social ostracism, threats barely disguised as warnings. He made it clear that continuing to oppose him would have consequences. But Eleanor and Anna refused to back down. They'd spent their whole lives being intimidated by men who wielded power like weapons. They'd learned that submission didn't actually protect you. It just taught predators that you could be pushed. Sometimes the only option was to push back, regardless of the risks. Margaret herself became unexpectedly strong through her recovery. The girl who'd arrived beaten and terrified began to transform into someone fierce with anger, anger that gave her courage, that made her willing to testify despite fear, that made her determined to ensure Blackwood faced consequences, even if she suffered for it. She told Eleanor one night that being silent was worse than being afraid, that letting Blackwood continue hurting others would mean her own suffering was pointless. At least if she spoke up, if she fought back, her pain might prevent someone else's pain. That possibility made the risk worth it. Eleanor recognized that fierce determination. It was the same determination she'd felt standing on the auction platform, the same refusal to be broken that had kept her spine straight through everything life had thrown at her. Margaret was discovering her own strength, and that strength would be the thing Blackwood couldn't defeat. The confrontation was coming. Everyone could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. The network Eleanor had built, the work they'd all committed to, the lives of vulnerable women across the territory, everything balanced on what happened next. They prepared themselves for battle. Not physical violence, though that was always possible, but the battle of testimony and evidence and forcing a community to acknowledge truths they'd rather ignore. It was the kind of fight that couldn't be won with strength alone. It required courage and solidarity and the willingness to stand exposed to judgment while speaking truth. And on a morning in late spring, with the land blooming and the sky impossibly blue, Eleanor and Anna and Margaret walked into town together to face Cyrus Blackwood and the system that had protected him. The war they'd been preparing for had finally arrived. The territorial judge arrived in June, traveling his circuit through the small towns that dotted Montana's landscape, dispensing justice with the limited time and patience frontier law allowed. Cyrus Blackwood had assumed his wealth and connections would shield him, that the judge would hear the accusations, see the class difference between a respected businessman and a collection of desperate women, and dismiss the charges before they gained traction. He'd miscalculated. Judge Harrison Cain was an older man, weathered by decades of frontier justice, and he'd seen too many powerful men hide behind respectability while committing acts that would make outlaws look honorable. He'd learned to recognize the signs. Communities too afraid to speak, women who bore marks of violence everyone pretended not to see, the careful silence that surrounded certain men's names. When Eleanor and Anna presented their case, testimony from multiple women, documentation from Dr. Daniels, evidence of a pattern of exploitation and violence, the judge listened with an attention that surprised even them. He asked questions that showed he understood the complexity of proving crimes against women when the entire social structure was designed to dismiss their testimony. Blackwood's lawyer was smooth and experienced, trained in the art of making victims look unreliable. He questioned each woman's moral character. He implied they'd sought out their employment knowing full well what would be expected. He suggested their testimony was coordinated by troublemakers, specifically Eleanor Hayes, that former auction girl who'd been causing problems since Samuel Hayes had made the mistake of bringing her to respectable society. The lawyer's strategy was clear: put Eleanor on trial instead of Blackwood, make her the villain in this story, remind everyone that she'd been sold at auction, imply what that meant about her character, suggest that respectable people should dismiss anything she said. But when Eleanor took the witness stand, something unexpected happened. She didn't defend herself against the lawyer's insinuations. She didn't apologize for her past or try to present herself as somehow exceptional among women who'd been exploited. Instead, she spoke with devastating honesty about what it meant to be sold, about what it meant to be valued only for labor you could provide and abuse you could endure, about how systems of exploitation required everyone to pretend they didn't see what was happening right in front of them, about how powerful men counted on silence, counted on shame, counted on the belief that some people didn't deserve protection. She told the judge that yes, she'd been sold at auction. Yes, she'd worked in situations where men had claimed the right to use her however they saw fit. Yes, she'd survived things she shouldn't have had to survive. And those experiences, far from making her testimony unreliable, made her the perfect person to recognize exploitation when she saw it. Because she knew what Cyrus Blackwood was doing to these women. She knew it in her bones, in her scars, in the nightmares she still sometimes woke from. She knew it because she'd lived it, and surviving it had given her the responsibility to stop it from happening to others when she had the power to intervene. The courtroom fell into absolute silence when Eleanor finished speaking. Even Blackwood's lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss for how to counter testimony that didn't defend, but rather claimed her past as qualification rather than disqualification. Judge Cain asked Eleanor one question. Did she have any financial or personal interest in seeing Blackwood convicted beyond wanting to stop him from hurting more women? Eleanor's answer was simple. No financial interest. But personal? Yes. She had the deeply personal interest of any person who'd survived violence in preventing that violence from continuing. She had the personal interest of someone who'd been given a second chance and wanted to extend that same possibility to others. Was that bias? Perhaps. But the judge could decide if the bias of someone who cared about preventing harm was less reliable than the supposed objectivity of people who'd benefited from looking away. Judge Cain's expression was unreadable. He called for a recess to consider the testimony he'd heard. During that recess, the town held its collective breath. Blackwood supporters insisted justice would prevail, by which they meant their wealthy ally would escape consequences. Eleanor's supporters prayed that for once, the frontier legal system might actually protect the vulnerable instead of reinforcing the power of those who exploited them. Samuel found Eleanor outside the courthouse, standing in the shade, her body taut with tension. He didn't ask how she was feeling. The question would have been absurd. Instead, he just stood beside her, offering silent solidarity, reminding her through his presence that whatever happened, she wasn't facing it alone. Anna appeared with Margaret, both women's faces showing the strain of public testimony, of exposing themselves to judgment, of standing as witnesses against a man whose power had once seemed absolute. Margaret was trembling, not from fear now, but from the emotional cost of reliving trauma for an audience of strangers who might or might not believe her. The four of them stood together in that quiet moment before the verdict, and Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't just about stopping Blackwood. This wasn't even just about helping vulnerable women find safety. This was about proving something fundamental, that change was possible, that power could be challenged, that the old systems didn't have to persist simply because they'd always existed. Win or lose, they'd proven that resistance was possible. They'd shown that women could organize, could gather evidence, could stand in public and speak truth even when the entire social structure was designed to keep them silent. That had value regardless of what the judge decided. The judge returned to the courthouse, and everyone filed back inside. The room was packed now, word had spread through town, and people wanted to witness what would happen. Some came hoping to see Blackwood vindicated, eager to have their comfortable assumptions confirmed. Others came hoping against hope that justice might actually be served. Judge Cain looked out across the courtroom with weary eyes that had seen too much human cruelty over too many years. Then he delivered his judgment. He found Cyrus Blackwood guilty, not of every charge. Frontier law was murky on issues of labor exploitation, and some of what Blackwood had done existed in gray areas where wealth had always provided protection. But guilty of assault on Margaret, guilty of maintaining dangerous conditions in properties where women lived, guilty of enough that the sentence would be severe by frontier standards. Blackwood would pay substantial fines. He would serve time in the territorial prison. He would be barred from employing women in his businesses. His properties would be audited, and any women currently working for him would be released from their contracts without penalty. The judgment rippled through the courtroom like thunder. Blackwood's face went purple with rage. His lawyer immediately began talking about appeals. His supporters looked shocked that one of their own had actually been held accountable. But Eleanor and Anna and Margaret and Samuel and all the women who'd testified, they felt something different. Not triumph, exactly. The cost had been too high for that. Not complete satisfaction. One conviction didn't dismantle entire systems of exploitation. But relief. The profound relief of being heard, of being believed, of having their testimony matter enough to create consequences. Judge Cain added one more statement before dismissing the court. He said that frontier society was changing, that the old assumptions about who deserved protection and who could be exploited with impunity were being challenged, and that the law would need to adapt. He commended Eleanor and Anna for their work, called their network a model for how communities could better protect their vulnerable members. Then he looked directly at Blackwood and said something that would echo through the territory for years. Power without accountability was tyranny, and tyranny had no place in free society. Men who used their position to exploit those with less power were no better than common criminals, regardless of how much property they owned or how many influential friends they claimed. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed out in quiet conversation, processing what had happened, what it might mean for their community. Eleanor and her group stayed until the room had mostly cleared, needing a moment to absorb their victory before facing the reactions waiting outside. Samuel took Eleanor's hand, a simple gesture, but one that contained everything they'd built together. She squeezed back, grateful for his steady presence, grateful that she had someone who stood beside her through battles like this without trying to fight them for her. Anna embraced Margaret, and the two women held each other for a long moment, survivor recognizing survivor, witness honoring witness, both of them understanding that what they'd done today would resonate far beyond themselves. They walked out of the courthouse together into the afternoon sun. The town looked the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted. Women watched them from porches and windows with new expressions, not just curiosity or judgment, but something approaching respect, recognition that these four people had challenged power and won, that resistance was possible if you were willing to pay its price. The work wasn't finished. One victory didn't erase all the exploitation that persisted across the frontier. But it was proof that systems could be challenged, proof that women's testimony could be believed, proof that justice, while rare and hard-won, wasn't entirely impossible. They rode back to the ranch in the golden light of late afternoon, exhausted but unbowed, carrying the weight of what they'd accomplished and the knowledge of how much work remained. That night, sitting around the dinner table, they talked about what came next, how to expand their network now that they'd proven its legitimacy, how to use this victory to encourage other communities to create similar systems, how to help women still trapped in situations like Margaret had escaped. The Hayes Ranch had become more than just their home. It was the center of a movement that was quietly reshaping what was possible for frontier women. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real, and it was growing, and it gave hope to people who'd lived too long without it. Eleanor looked around the table at these people who'd become her chosen family, Samuel, who'd offered her freedom, Anna, who'd found her way home, Margaret, who'd discovered her strength through survival. She thought about the women they'd helped, the lives they'd changed, the small revolutions they enacted every day by insisting that exploitation wasn't inevitable. They'd built something worth defending, something worth the risks they'd taken, something that would outlast them and continue growing, creating possibilities for women they'd never meet in places they'd never see. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 2 years passed like water over stone. slowly wearing away old patterns, gradually reshaping the landscape into something new. The Hayes Ranch expanded. Not dramatically, but steadily. Samuel and Eleanor built additional structures to house more women temporarily. They brought in livestock that provided income beyond Samuel's limited crops. They created a sustainable model that didn't require constant outside support to survive. Anna became the true heart of the network that stretched across the territory. She traveled between towns, connecting women who needed help with families and businesses willing to provide fair employment. She built relationships with other judges and lawyers who'd seen what happened with Blackwood and were slowly beginning to acknowledge that frontier justice needed to protect everyone, not just property owners and powerful men. Margaret never left. She'd intended to move on once she'd healed, to find her own path forward somewhere else, but she discovered that the ranch had become her home, that helping other women navigate trauma she understood intimately gave her life. Meaning she couldn't find elsewhere. She became Eleanor's apprentice in a sense, learning the skills of advocacy and network building, preparing to eventually create similar sanctuaries in other territories. Samuel aged into his role with grace. His ranch had become legend, not as his ranch anymore, but as theirs. The women who lived and worked there weren't his employees or his wards. They were partners in an enterprise that transcended individual ownership. He'd learned what Eleanor had been teaching him all along, that letting go of control didn't mean losing power. It meant sharing it in ways that multiplied what everyone could accomplish. The community's attitude toward them evolved gradually. Not everyone accepted what the Hayes Ranch represented. There were still those who saw Eleanor as troublesome, who thought Samuel was being manipulated by dangerous women, who believed the old ways were better simply because they were familiar. But enough people changed their minds that it mattered. Enough families began sending daughters to learn from Eleanor and Anna. Enough businessmen realized that treating women fairly actually created more stable workforces. Enough religious leaders started preaching about exploitation instead of just abstract sin. Change happened slowly on the frontier, but it happened. Reverend Warren died in the second winter, his work incomplete, but his impact undeniable. Before he passed, he told Eleanor that his only regret was not starting this work sooner. Not speaking up for his daughter when it might have mattered, not challenging the systems that had killed her. But he died knowing that his final years had counted for something, that his alliance with Eleanor had helped create lasting change. His replacement, a younger minister named Tobias Chen, continued the work with even more energy. Chen had come west after watching his own sisters struggle against exploitation in San Francisco. He saw the Hayes Ranch not as threat to social order, but as model for what church and community could accomplish when they prioritized human dignity over traditional hierarchy. The network expanded beyond Montana. Women in neighboring territories heard about what was being built and wanted to create similar systems. Eleanor and Anna shared their methods freely. They'd learned that hoarding knowledge was the strategy of those who wanted to maintain control. Creating widespread change required sharing everything they'd learned, even if it meant losing their unique position. Sarah came back one spring, the first woman who'd stayed with them years ago when the network was barely formed. She returned as someone transformed, confident, employed as a teacher in a town 2 territories over, making her own living and her own choices. She thanked Eleanor for the chance she'd been given, but Eleanor corrected her gently. Eleanor hadn't given Sarah anything. She'd just gotten out of the way and let Sarah claim what had always been hers. The right to choose her own life, to make her own mistakes, to build her own future on foundations of autonomy rather than submission. That distinction mattered to Eleanor. She'd spent too much of her life having things done to her or for her by people who thought they knew better. The work she'd built with Samuel and Anna wasn't about saving women. It was about creating space for women to save themselves. Samuel's health began to fail in the 3rd year, not dramatically, but the slow deterioration of a body that had worked too hard for too long. His broken arm from the storm never healed properly. His ribs ached in cold weather. The accumulated weight of frontier life was catching up with him. Eleanor watched him slow down with complicated feelings. She loved this man who'd given her freedom, who'd stood beside her through everything, who'd never once demanded she be anything other than herself. The thought of losing him was almost unbearable. But Samuel faced his declining health with the same steady acceptance he brought to everything. He told Eleanor one night that he'd lived more in the years with her than he had in all the years before. That building this network, helping these women, living in partnership with someone who saw him clearly, that had given his life meaning he'd thought he'd lost forever with Rachel and Thomas. If his time was limited, at least he'd spent it well. Eleanor refused to accept that his time was ending. She insisted they find better medical care, that they travel to a larger city where doctors might actually know what they were doing. But Samuel reminded her that he was 53 years old and had lived hard. There was no miracle cure for being worn down by life. What he wanted, he told her, was to keep doing the work as long as his body allowed, to witness the impact they'd had, to see women they'd helped come back transformed, to know that when he was gone, Eleanor and Anna and Margaret and all the others would continue building what they'd started. He wanted to trust that his legacy wasn't property or wealth, but the lives that had been changed because he'd made one decent choice at an auction 3 years ago. Eleanor fought tears she rarely allowed herself. She told Samuel that he was wrong about one thing. The decent choice hadn't been buying her. The decent choice had been everything that came after. The respect he'd shown, the space he'd given, the partnership he'd built, the willingness to share power instead of wielding it. That was what had changed her life. That was what had made everything else possible. Samuel smiled, a rare thing for a man whose face carried so much weathered sadness. He told her she'd changed his life too, that she'd reminded him what it meant to live with purpose instead of just surviving out of habit. That loving her, because yes, that's what this was, even if it had taken him too long to name it, that loving her had been the best thing he'd done in a life of mostly just enduring. They sat in the darkness holding hands, and Eleanor let herself feel the full weight of what they'd built together. This partnership that had started as transaction and become transformation. This love that didn't look like stories claimed love should look, but was more real and more honest because it was built on choice and respect instead of possession and control. The next morning, Samuel didn't wake. He'd gone in his sleep, peaceful and without pain, his body simply deciding it had worked enough. Eleanor found him still holding the hand she'd fallen asleep clasping, and she sat beside him for a long time before calling for Anna and Margaret. The grief was immense. Not just for Eleanor, but for everyone who'd known Samuel, everyone who'd been touched by his quiet integrity, everyone who'd seen him model what it meant to support women's autonomy instead of fighting against it. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, beside the graves of Rachel and Thomas. Eleanor stood at the funeral and spoke about the man who'd given her freedom, who'd taught her that partnership meant shared power, who'd proved that men could choose differently if they were willing to challenge what they'd been taught about masculinity and control. The townspeople who came to the funeral saw something unexpected, Eleanor standing there not as a grieving widow overcome by loss, but as someone honoring a partner who'd helped her become more herself. She didn't perform helplessness or dependence. She performed strength and gratitude and the determination to continue the work they'd built together. Because that's what Samuel would have wanted. Not for her to collapse without him, but to prove that what they'd created was sustainable beyond any one person, that the network, the sanctuary, the revolution they'd started, that it would continue growing regardless of who remained to tend it. In the months after Samuel's death, Eleanor discovered something unexpected. She discovered that she wasn't the same person who'd stood on that auction platform 4 years ago. She'd transformed so completely that sometimes she barely recognized the frightened girl she'd been. That girl had believed she had no choices, had believed her value was only what others assigned to her, had believed survival meant accepting whatever scraps of safety powerful people might offer. This woman knew differently. She knew choice was always possible even when it was hard. She knew her value was inherent and couldn't be assigned or removed by others' opinions. She knew survival was important, but living, truly living, required building something worth surviving for. Samuel had helped her learn those lessons, but she'd done the actual work herself. She'd made the choices, she'd built the trust, she'd claimed the space, she'd transformed herself not by erasing who she'd been, but by integrating all her pieces, the wounded parts and the strong parts and the parts still learning, into someone whole. And now she had to prove it, had to show that the work continued, had to demonstrate that women could build lasting institutions without needing men to maintain them. The first winter without Samuel was brutal, not just because of weather, but because of grief and doubt, and the 1,000 small moments when Eleanor reached for partnership that was no longer there. She missed him with an ache that never fully subsided. Missed his steady presence, his quiet support, his way of seeing her clearly without judgment. But she also discovered she was stronger than she'd known, that the years with Samuel had taught her not dependence, but capability, that she could run the ranch, maintain the network, make decisions that affected multiple lives, all without needing someone else to validate her choices. Anna and Margaret were there, of course. The partnership Eleanor had with them was different from what she'd had with Samuel, but no less important. They worked together as equals, each bringing different strengths, each filling gaps the others had. Together, they proved something crucial, that women didn't need male protection or oversight to build meaningful institutions, that autonomy and cooperation weren't contradictory. That chosen family was as strong as blood family, and sometimes stronger because it was built on respect rather than obligation. The network continued to grow. More women found their way to safety. More communities created their own versions of what the Hayes Ranch had pioneered. The movement that had started with one man making one decent choice at an auction had expanded into something that touched lives across multiple territories. Eleanor watched it all with a mixture of pride and humility. Pride in what they'd accomplished. Humility in understanding that this work was bigger than any individual, that movements required countless people making countless small choices to challenge systems that had always seemed unchangeable. 5 years after the auction, 6 years after Samuel's death, Eleanor stood on the same platform where she'd once been sold. But this time, she was there by choice. This time, she was there to speak. The town had organized a public meeting about labor practices and women's rights, topics that had been unthinkable for public discussion just years earlier. Eleanor had been invited to share her story, to explain how the network functioned, to offer testimony about what was possible when communities committed to protecting their most vulnerable members. She looked out at the crowd, some supportive, some skeptical, some openly hostile. She saw faces that had been at her auction, people who'd watched her being sold and done nothing. She saw families whose daughters had stayed at the ranch. She saw women who'd found freedom through the network, now living independent lives. And she spoke, not with anger or bitterness about her past, but with clear-eyed honesty about what systems of exploitation did to people. About how being treated as property damaged something fundamental in your sense of self. About how long it took to rebuild trust and autonomy after they'd been stripped away. But she also spoke about transformation, about how change was possible, both personal change and systemic change, about how individuals making different choices created ripples that eventually became waves, about how the frontier was evolving, slowly and imperfectly, towards something that might actually deserve to call itself free for everyone, not just for property-owning men. She told them about Samuel, about how one man's decision to offer freedom instead of control had catalyzed everything that came after, about how his legacy wasn't property or wealth, but proof that men could choose differently, could support women's autonomy instead of feeling threatened by it. She told them about the network, about hundreds of women who'd found safety and opportunity through connections forged by people who believed exploitation wasn't inevitable, about communities that had committed to creating alternatives to the auction block and the workhouse and all the other systems that treated human beings as commodities. And she told them about choice, about how everything came back to that fundamental right, the right to choose your own path, make your own decisions, claim your own life, about how denying that right to anyone, whether through slavery or exploitation, or the thousand small ways society restricted autonomy, that denial diminished everyone, not just those directly affected. The crowd listened. Not all of them were convinced, not all of them wanted to change their comfortable assumptions, but they listened, and listening was the first step toward understanding, and understanding was the first step toward change. After Eleanor finished speaking, questions came, some genuine, some hostile, some testing whether her story was real or some kind of performance. She answered them all with the same honest directness that had defined her testimony against Blackwood, refusing to soften difficult truths to make them more palatable. One older woman stood and asked the question Eleanor had been waiting for. Who did she think she was, standing up there telling respectable people how to organize their society? What gave a girl who'd been sold at auction the authority to lecture others about morality and social structure? Eleanor's answer was simple but devastating. She had the authority of someone who'd survived what their social structures did to vulnerable people. She had the authority of someone who'd lived the consequences of systems they only theorized about. She had the authority that came from building alternatives that actually worked, that actually helped people, that actually created the freedom their society claimed to value, but rarely extended to women without wealth or family protection. If that wasn't enough authority, she didn't know what would be. The woman sat down without responding, and Eleanor saw something shift in her expression, not agreement necessarily, but the kind of uncomfortable recognition that comes when someone forces you to question assumptions you'd rather not examine. The meeting ended without resolution. These things never had clean endings, never produced immediate transformation, but it planted seeds, made people think, started conversations that continued long after Eleanor left the platform. She walked out of that town hall into twilight, and Anna and Margaret were waiting for her. They'd heard the whole thing from the back of the room, and their faces showed pride in what Eleanor had accomplished. Not just the speech, but everything that had led to the speech, the years of work, the battles fought and won, the slow accumulation of credibility and influence. They rode back to the ranch together as night fell, talking about the reactions they'd seen, planning next steps, discussing which communities might be ready for similar conversations. The work was endless. There would always be more women needing help, more systems requiring change, more battles to fight against those who benefited from exploitation. But the work was also meaningful. It gave their lives purpose beyond mere survival. It connected them to something larger than themselves, a movement toward justice that had started long before them and would continue long after them. When they arrived at the ranch, Eleanor walked to the hill where Samuel was buried. She stood there in the darkness, looking down at the home they'd built together, the sanctuary that had become legend, the proof that transformation was possible. She told Samuel, told his memory, told the stars, told herself that they'd done it. They'd built something that lasted, something that mattered, something that proved broken people could heal, that systems could be challenged. that love based on respect and equality was not only possible but powerful. She thanked him for the freedom he'd offered, for the space he'd given, for the partnership that had taught her what healthy love could look like, for being willing to change his understanding of manhood to support her autonomy instead of controlling it. And she promised to continue, to keep building, to keep fighting, to keep creating spaces where women could choose their own lives, to honor his memory not through grief and paralysis, but through action and persistence, and the stubborn refusal to accept that exploitation was inevitable. The wind moved through the grass around Samuel's grave, and Eleanor chose to hear it as affirmation, chose to believe that somewhere, somehow, the man who'd given her freedom was watching this empire of choice they'd built together and feeling proud of what they'd accomplished. She walked back down the hill to the house where lights glowed warm in the windows, where Anna and Margaret were preparing dinner, where women who'd found safety were building new lives, where the work continued, endless and exhausting and absolutely essential. Eleanor Hayes, no longer the girl sold at auction, but the woman who'd chosen everything that came after, opened the door and walked into the home she'd built, into the life she'd claimed, into the future she was still creating, one choice at a time. And in that moment, standing in the doorway with warmth at her back and the vast Montana night stretching before her, Eleanor understood something fundamental. Home wasn't a place you found. It wasn't something given or sold or transferred through transaction. Home was what you built when you had the freedom to choose. Home was what you created when you had people who stood beside you rather than over you. Home was what emerged when you stopped surviving and started living. She'd found her home, had made her home, had proven that even people sold at auction, even people told they had no value beyond their labor, even people stripped of choice and autonomy, even they could build something beautiful, something lasting, something that mattered. The door closed behind her, but it was the kind of closing that meant belonging rather than confinement, the kind that meant she was exactly where she'd chosen to be, surrounded by people she'd chosen to love, doing work she'd chosen to pursue. The auction had been the beginning, but the choosing, the continuous daily courageous act of choosing, that was everything. That was the story. That was the legacy. And it would continue long after her own chapter ended, spreading across the frontier like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever people were brave enough to believe that systems could change, that exploitation wasn't inevitable, that freedom could be chosen even by those who'd been told they had no right to choose. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. The land stretched vast and unforgiving under the Montana sky. The work continued, endless and imperfect and absolutely necessary. And Eleanor Hayes, survivor, advocate, architect of revolution disguised as simple kindness, she chose to keep building, one choice at a time, one woman at a time, one asit of defiant hope at a time, until the world transformed into something worthy of the freedom it claimed to offer, until home meant safety for everyone, not just the powerful, until choosing became everyone's birthright, not just the privilege of those born with money or property or the right last name. That was the vision, that was the work. That was what Samuel had started and Eleanor had built, and countless others would continue, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Give this story a like to keep the fire burning. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next ride across the frontier.